Well, good morning and welcome to The Real Story on this Sunday. I'm Ben Goldman. Al and Jen are both off this week. The death of George Floyd, who died while in a Minneapolis police officer kneeling on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Floyd's death serving as a flashpoint, sparking a movement in the United States, forcing all of us to have the difficult conversations about race in America, policing, and inequality. Protests across the country this week, many of them peaceful, and by nightfall giving way to rioting in some U.S. cities. That leading to a crackdown. Heavily armed officers, the National Guard activated, and military force used in our nation's capital. But here in Connecticut, the movement continues. Protests spreading from the cities now to the suburbs in our state. Several highways shut down in the last week. But will what happens on Connecticut streets truly affect change? Fox 61's Brian Didlick spoke to Senator Richard Blumenthal about what he's trying to do in Washington.
So joining me now is Senator Richard Blumenthal, who Friday just announced some new legislation. Can you tell us about it real quick?
Very important legislation at this moment in our history when we ought to be very proud of the peaceful demonstrations and protests by young people and others calling for justice, demanding that reform be the result of this tragic George Floyd murder. And what we're seeing in Connecticut is restraint on the part of police, professionalism, and also on the part of the demonstrators. But the president's trying to use these demonstrations as an excuse to use military force against American citizens. And my legislation would reform a slavery-era statute known as the Insurrection Act. It dates from 1807. It's been rarely used, but it gives the president virtually unbridled, undefined power to use our United States military against American citizens. And what I'm saying is there ought to be some oversight and accountability, just as there is when the president uses military force abroad against our foes. He has to come to Congress after a period of time. The protections for American citizens ought to be no less than when the president uses military force abroad. And this reform is tremendously important to protect individual freedoms and liberties, constitutional freedom of speech and assembly that otherwise the president might well suppress.
So what this legislation basically means is we're restricting what the president can do in terms of deploying troops from the National Guard, like here in Connecticut, to protests or to any other type of domestic events, correct?
Exactly right. In other words, for example, at Lafayette Park in Washington, D.C., members of the military, United States forces were used against those American citizens with the kind of gas, tear gas, and other chemicals, the other incendiary devices that were used to scare them and move them and actually physically force them out of the park. Those United States troops were used to suppress a peaceful demonstration. And here, around the country, we have the possibility that the president might call out active duty military forces. If you look at what General Mattis, General Allen, General Mullen were saying when they criticized the president for raising this possibility, what I'm saying is Congress should hold the president accountable. Within 14 days, he has to stop unless there's a resolution from Congress. Before he even begins it, he has to come to Congress to certify that there's a real need for it, not to restrict rights, but to preserve them.
And just going into these protests, you know, some are more disruptive, some are more violent, but here in Connecticut, we haven't seen any of that, besides maybe a freeway shutdown for a couple hours or, you know, people marching through the streets. You know, what does that say about Connecticut right now in terms of how we're expressing our First Amendment rights?
I think the peaceful and well-articulated, restrained way that Connecticut demonstrators and protesters have conducted these events says a lot about our conscience and conviction as a people in Connecticut. It also speaks to the professionalism of police because they have sought to de-escalate any sort of spike or outbreak of possible vandalism or violence. And I have heard that there have been folks in the crowds in Connecticut that have tried to incite. Police have basically allowed the protesters themselves to shout them down rather than taking action that might have escalated the violence. But here's the really important point. I think the vast majority of these demonstrations around the country have been impressively peaceful. And yes, there has been looting, destruction, violence. We all regret it. No one really ought to condone it. It has been largely, I think, the result of, call them outsiders, call them outliers, call them inciters or agitators, whatever you want to call them. Their interest is not in demonstrating, and I don't view them as part of the demonstrations.
You know, and just speaking a part of these demonstrations, you know, it does have a greater conversation that needs to be had, you know, here in America. And, you know, some things that I've noticed from the front lines reporting, you know, is having those uncomfortable conversations, you know. In your position, you know, being an elected official, what type of uncomfortable conversations should we start having in Congress and start having abroad in our politics right now?
I think I've been having some uncomfortable conversations with colleagues largely on the other side of the aisle who don't want action for more opportunity in education, more equality in healthcare, greater mobility in housing, and of course our justice system, which results in people of color being incarcerated at a disproportionate rate. If you look at crimes like marijuana, who is going to be arrested, convicted, incarcerated? Much more likely if you're somebody of color. I'm a former law enforcer. I was United States Attorney for 4.5 years here, the Chief Federal Prosecutor. I was the State Attorney General for 20 years. I believe in law enforcement, and the professionalism of our FBI, our state police, our local police are very important and impressive. But we need to make sure that we have those uncomfortable conversations, not only with colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but frankly, with the people whom we represent. And I've been to one of those demonstrations in Bridgeport where young people, about 30 of them, were expressing their anger and their pain. And I've heard my colleague, Cory Booker, and Kamala Harris talk about their experiences growing up. Discomfort is a good thing if it stretches you, if it makes you learn, and listening is so important.
You know, I'm certainly not exempt from anything protesters are talking about, just being quite frank. I grew up with my father telling me not to fully trust the police, but on the other hand, I'm also the nephew of a Texas State Trooper. So I understand a little bit of both sides, but just in your own terms of being a former law enforcer, how can we start bridging the gap between two different cultures, one that I was taught to fear at one point?
That is a really good question, and it's a complicated one, as you know from your own experience. And for example, black friends of mine have told me very frankly, they got the keys to the car, and their dad said to them, "You're going to be held to a different standard. Keep your hands on the wheel if you're ever stopped. Don't reach for the glove compartment. It's yes, sir, no, sir. I don't care what you hear your friends, white people, say about the cops being your friends. You adhere to the rules we're given to you." That shouldn't be in America. That just shouldn't be. That's not America. Different treatment, different standards for people of different races. And so we need to make sure that our police are given the training. We need to screen those police. You know, we have come in the last decades, I've watched the quality of our law enforcers increased dramatically. And that's because of screening. It's because the troopers or the local officers are evaluated, and because we have independent review and, if necessary, independent discipline and independent prosecution, not from within the police force, not from within the city, but outside it, independently, objectively, independent prosecutors if necessary. On the other side, we also need to make sure that the police are part of the community. We talk about community policing, but it's easier to talk about than it is to do. And in all of these kinds of endeavors, training, recruitment, screening, education, community practices, protocols, standards for the use of force, those standards are really important. The federal government can play a greater role. That's why I have led and sponsored the Training and Independent Review Act, the Police Training and Independent Review Act. Law enforcement really deserves more federal support when it does the right thing.
Gotcha. And even going a little bit deeper, just something that my uncle was teaching me when he was talking about the law enforcement side of things. There is somewhat of a culture, depending on what department you are in, where you have this culture of not taking responsibility for your coworkers' actions and, you know, checking them in a sense and making sure that they're doing the right thing. How do we even go about even trying to attempt to start changing that culture?
That's a really good point, and I think it is partly the result of what we're seeing on the streets in our communities. I think law enforcement has been impressed by the depth of feeling and passion that they have seen. This isn't just about young people, it isn't about one age, it isn't about one part of the country, it's about our whole country and all of us having to come together because, let's be very blunt, racism is still endemic to this country. Racism is still with us. And so is religious bias and bigotry. But we all have a part in trying to address it. It won't be changed overnight, but it's all of our responsibility. And so when you talk about changing the culture in law enforcement, it is a matter of changing the culture in our country generally. Law enforcement is just a reflection of it. You know, I'm on the Armed Services Committee as well as the Judiciary. And one of the great success stories in our nation in terms of bridging racial divides is our United States military. 2 of my 4 children have served in the military, one as a Marine and the other in the Navy doing special operations. And they will tell you that it doesn't make any difference what color you are. When you're out there and your life is in danger, you're all one people. And that's one of the lessons here for law enforcement, that no matter what your race, it's a common cause and a common threat if your life is in jeopardy. And so I think that is taking hold. It wasn't overnight for the military, and I think it is an enormous achievement for law enforcement to come as far as it has. And I think that's one reason why these demonstrations over the past few days have been so successful. The other is, frankly, the demonstrations themselves have involved whites and African Americans together.
You know, how important is that for us going forward right now, just being together when we say, you know, whites and blacks? The whole conversation of having allies at this point is so crucial right now. Can we just talk about how, you know, having a different voice other than a voice that looks like my own, just be speaking out right now?
We need to speak up in different languages in the sense that we come from different places, even among whites, even among blacks, all people of color, Latinos and Hispanics, Asian Americans. I will say this, it may be the most important thing I have to say, which is we are the greatest nation in the history of the world because of our diversity. Not always easy. We had a civil war. Americans shot and killed each other. But we have conquered many of our differences because essentially Americans know that diversity is our strength. People of different talents and energies and backgrounds. We're a nation of immigrants, which is unique among nations. And we still have to overcome racism. It won't go away on its own. But what's needed is, as you put it very well, is for us to come together. And I think the pandemic has forced us to come together in ways we didn't anticipate. It is an insidious, horrific disease. I've seen it take lives, as we all have, of friends. A friend of mine who passed away, his children played with mine when they were growing up. I know we've all been touched with it, coworkers, neighbors, friends, loved ones. We've come together against this common enemy. And I think we need to continue to come together. And I think your point about community is tremendously important.
A thoughtful and meaningful conversation with Brian Didlake and Senator Richard Blumenthal. The Real Story continues right after this. Stay with us.